In 1992, a construction crew was hired to expand the parking lot of what had once been the St. Agnes Home for children in rural Ohio. The foreman expected to hit rock by the second day. What they hit instead were bones, small bones, dozens of them arranged in rows so precise they could only have been intentional. No headstones, no markers, no names, just 34 sets of remains buried in a grid pattern behind what used to be the East Wing dormitory where children slept in shifts because there were never enough beds. What made investigators stop cold wasn't the number of graves. It was the age of the bones. Every single one of them belonged to a child under the age of 12. And according to the institution's own intake records that had been sitting in a county archive untouched for 60 years, most of those children had not been orphans at all. This is not a single story. This is a pattern, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Between 1850 and 1930, the United States built what historians now describe as one of the largest child institutionalization systems in the Western world. At its peak, there were more than 900 orphan asylums operating across the country, housing an estimated 150,000 children. At any given time, the word orphan was used loosely, sometimes deliberately so. A 1909 White House conference on the care of dependent children found that the majority of children in American institutions at that time had at least one living parent. In some states, that number was closer to 70%. These were not children without families. These were children whose families had been broken by poverty, by illness, by economic collapse, and who had been taken in by institutions that in many cases were never designed to give them back. If you want to understand how that was possible, how an entire generation of children could vanish into a system while their parents were still alive, subscribe to this channel. I cover stories like this every week, the ones that don't make it into textbooks, the ones that were buried just as carefully as those 34 children in Ohio. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. The Panic of 1873 is where this particular chapter begins. The American economy collapsed almost without warning. Banks failed. Factories shuttered. Unemployment in cities like New York and Chicago would be unthinkable to numbers that some estimates put it at 30% in certain urban districts. Families that had been stable working class intact found themselves unable to feed their children within months. And waiting for them in every major city were the institutions. They had different names. The Children's Aid Society, the New York Foundling Hospital, the Chicago Home for the Friendless. Some were run by churches, some by the city, some by private philanthropists whose intentions were genuine and whose methods were even, by the standards of the time, catastrophic. What they shared was a common intake philosophy. A child brought to their door was a child in need, regardless of whether a parent was standing right beside them. In many institutions, the paperwork required to surrender a child was less complicated than the paperwork required to reclaim one. That was not an accident. Here is the detail that investigators kept returning to in the decades that followed. Across dozens of institutions in at least 14 states, historians have documented the same sequence of events. A parent, usually a mother, usually widowed or recently separated, would bring a child to an institution during an economic crisis. She would be told the arrangement was temporary, that when her situation improved, she could return for her child. She would sign a form, and in that form, buried in language she may not have fully understood, was a clause granting the institution the right to place that child in another home in another state without further parental consent. Some of those children were placed in good homes, some were not, and some of them, the youngest, the sickest, the ones who arrived already weakened by malnutrition, never left the institution at all. The mortality rates inside these facilities were not hidden. They appeared in annual reports and city council budgets and church bulletins. They were just never aggregated in a way that forced anyone to confront what they meant. A Foundling hospital in Lower Manhattan reported an annual infant mortality rate of 63%. Its 1887 report. That number appeared in the 15th paragraph after the budget summary and before the list of donors. In Baltimore, an 1891 audit of 3 affiliated Catholic orphanages found that of the 340 children admitted in a single year had died before the year was out. The cause of death listed in most cases was a single word: decline. And then there were the ones buried on the grounds. Not every institution had a cemetery, but more of them did than most people realize. It made practical sense in a grim way. Transporting the body of a child who had no identified family to a public cemetery required paperwork fees, a death certificate filed with the city. An on-site burial required none of that. Some institutions had formal arrangements with local parishes and maintained small marked In the case of the St. Agnes Home in Ohio, records show that between 1878 and 1921, the facility reported 41 deaths to the county registrar. Construction workers in 1992 found 34 sets of remains. Researchers who later cross-referenced those numbers found no record of the other 7 children in any county, death registry in any church, burial record in any document at all. They were simply gone. If you're still watching this, you already understand why this matters. Subscribe so you're here when I get to what happened in Illinois, because that case makes Ohio look like a footnote. There are at least 3 explanations historians have proposed for what happened inside these institutions, and none of them are comfortable. The first is systemic negligence. Children in overcrowded facilities with inadequate ventilation and little medical care died of diseases that were entirely tuberculosis, measles, cholera, typhoid. This is not a conspiracy. It is the predictable result of placing hundreds of malnourished children. The mortality was not intentional. It was the consequence of a system that was underfunded, poorly regulated, and operating under the assumption that saving a child from poverty was sufficient justification for everything that followed. Under this theory, the unmarked graves are the result of bureaucratic failure, not malice. The second theory is more uncomfortable. Some researchers who have spent years inside the archives of these institutions believe the mortality was not only predictable, but was at some level accommodated. Institutions received per-child funding from city and state governments, but the costs of a sick child medication additional care isolation were often not reimbursed. A child who died cost the institution nothing further. A child who survived but required sustained medical care was a liability. There is no documented evidence of deliberate harm. What there is evidence of is a pattern of delayed medical intervention of children who were ill for weeks before any physician was called of intake registers, where the notation "not expected to survive" appears beside a child's name on the day of admission. Evidence suggests the system created incentives that we are not comfortable naming directly. But the pattern is there. The third theory is the one that the families of these children have carried for generations. That the institutions knew exactly what they were doing. That the children who died in those facilities were not accidents and not liabilities. They were inconveniences. Children who were too sick to be placed, too damaged to be useful, too young to work on. The farms out west, where the orphan trains deposited their cargo. Under this theory, the paperwork was designed to obscure the burial. Records were left incomplete deliberately, and the parents who came back looking for their children were told what every parent in that situation was told. Your child was placed with a family in another state. We no longer have an address. No one was ever charged with a crime in the St. Agnes case. The institution had closed in 1934. The diocese that had operated it filed for reorganization twice in the 1990s. A legal settlement reached in 2004 resulted in a memorial plaque being installed at the site and a fund established for genealogical research. The 34 sets of remains were reinterred in a municipal cemetery with a ceremony attended by 14 people. There are researchers still working on this. There are families still looking for records. There are county archives in at least 8 states where the intake registers of closed institutions have never been fully reviewed, where the names of children who entered those buildings and never left are still sitting in boxes waiting for someone to open them. And what I keep coming back to, the thing I cannot get past when I look at the intake records of these facilities, is how ordinary it all looked. The handwriting in the ledgers is careful, consistent, institutional. The entries for the children who died are indistinguishable from the entries for the children who were placed and survived. There is no notation of grief. There is no acknowledgement that something has gone wrong. There is a name, a date of admission, a date of death, and then a line drawn underneath, and the next child's name begins. I want to know what you think about this, and I mean that. Do you believe the mortality in these institutions was the result of negligence and systemic failure, the predictable outcome of a broken, underfunded system, or do you believe there is something more deliberate here? Something that the incomplete records and the unmarked graves are pointing toward that we have not yet fully named? Tell me in the comments, because I read everyone in the conversation. That happens in this community is the reason I keep going deeper into these cases. If this is the kind of investigation you want more of, subscribe. I post news stories regularly and what I have coming. Next is an institution in the Pacific Northwest that received federal funding for 40 years while its own records show it buried more children than it ever successfully placed. That is a story that should have been told a long time ago.